You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everybody, and welcome to this edition of Insights, a product from the Conference Board. My name is Anne Stevens. I'm a Council Director here at the Conference Board, working with global business women leaders, HR executives in Europe, and global CHROs. Today we're talking about International Women's Day, and the theme, of course, is getting to equal. I'm delighted to welcome Graham Sparks to the Conference Board community across the world. Graham was Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Shell, where he was responsible for developing and implementing business-focused D&I strategies and policies across the company. He's got 35 years of broad experience in the oil and gas sector, including roles in human resources, sales, marketing, business management and manufacturing. Graham is a chemical engineer by profession and holds an executive MBA from Manchester Business School. He's also got extensive experience in developing strategies for achieving gender equality, LGBT workplace inclusion, and for enabling those with disabilities. His approach includes a focus on leadership, measurement, brand, and reputation. Graham works with organisations to develop and implement inclusive workplaces through a strategic approach to inclusion and diversity as it relates to business delivery, purpose and values. In 2019, Graham founded IAD Consulting, where he is now a director and principal consultant. Graham works closely with Catalyst as a consultant and is a member of the advisory board of Women's International Networking and Workplace Pride. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the charity Getting On Board, and he's based in the UK. Graham, delighted to welcome you here. Good afternoon.
Anne, thank you very much, and thank you to you and the Conference Board for inviting me to join this podcast. I had some great interactions with the Conference Board during my days with Shell, and it's nice to continue that as I move on to the next phase of my career around inclusion and diversity.
So Graham, engaging men, getting to gender balance in the workplace. If we're serious about achieving gender balance in the workplace, we need to make sure that men are actively engaged as partners with women. However, I understand there's some evidence that men are becoming less inclined to support these efforts. Why does it matter? And if it does matter, why and what can we do about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that section.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. And since leaving Shell, you mentioned Catalyst. I've been working closely with Catalyst around the subject of engaging men. Just for those that aren't familiar with that organisation, Catalyst is a not-for-profit set up in the US nearly 60 years ago now, working on building inclusive workplaces. And one of their pieces of research and learning that they bring forward is called MARC, which stands for Men Advocating Real Change. So it's in that context, plus my Shell experience, I'll share a few thoughts today. So yeah, let's pick up Anne, your first question. So why does this matter? I think there's a number of things in here. I think the first is basic, but really important, and that to me is that gender diversity is a business issue. I think for too long, and I've probably been guilty of this in the past, it's been positioned as a women's issue or something that women need to work on. I think more recently views have matured, but let's be clear, this is a business issue. And we need male influence in that in terms of taking this thing forward. And we do that in the context of an enormous amount of research and background, which is indicating that more diverse teams led by inclusive leaders lead to better business performance. So the first thing is a business issue. I think the second thing also to mention is if we look a little bit at the statistics, and working in the UK, I've followed the Davis report and the Hampton-Alexander report over many years now. And whilst it's true at board level things have improved, I think from the latest report that we're just about FTSE 100 companies are just about at a third in terms of the number of women on FTSE 100 boards. But then if you take it down the next level, so to the executive leadership, again, it's improved, but it's about just over 23%, which means in simple terms that if 23% of those exec boards are women, then 77% of the decisions around talent and hiring and all the rest of it are going to be made by men. So, we do all we can to remove bias and all the rest of it, but we better be sure if we want to create more diverse boards, then we better, and senior teams, then we need to have more women involved.
And would you say there's a bit of pressure coming from the market? I mean, external stakeholders, would you say that they're now, pushing much harder now to make sure we're doing more?
Very much so. I mean, there's no doubt. Obviously, the Me Too movement has had a significant and I think positive impact on the corporate world. But we're seeing this more specific now. There was a great little article from something that Goldman Sachs had done just a couple of months ago now, and Goldman Sachs basically said that they're not going to do IPO work for organisations which are going to the market with limited diversity. I mean, basically, they wanted to make sure there was at least one woman, one underrepresented group on the board of these companies they work with, and in future they'll reduce that. We'll get even tighter. They want to ensure that there's two on the board. So again, you see that sort of pressure coming forward. I think that's a positive thing, and I think we also see it in terms of consumer advertising, branding, marketing, etc. So it is starting to have an impact. And going back, as I touched on with the Hampton-Alexander report, they're also, putting a spotlight on those FTSE companies that have very low female board representation, calling them out, if you like. I mean, you can say there are no sanctions. That's probably true, but I think let the market decide. And I think highlighting this data and highlighting where the issues are will have an impact over time. So yes, to your point, definitely.
Thank you. And I guess the question then, to ask ourselves is if we are hearing that men are becoming less inclined to support women than perhaps they were previously, what is it? Why are men disengaged? What is causing this, if you like, this sort of this stoppage of where men can, should be and can be getting behind women in their progression?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single answer. I think there are a number of factors. I mean, some of it is probably well intended and perhaps speaks a little bit to male ego, but it's this thing about Anne, this is all very well, but it's not really me, because I'm really quite engaged with this. I've been working on this for a while. I believe in this. I can talk about this. So yes, I'm committed and I'll sponsor it, but it's probably somebody else. And none of these things are ever said, directly, as I'm perhaps having this conversation with you now. But I think that's some of what's going on. I think, at a more visceral level, men can feel blamed, and there's very much this zero-sum game that, if we end up promoting and progressing more women, by definition it means we promote and progress less men. I don't accept that, because this is about growth and success of companies, and if those companies grow because they've got more diverse boards and more inclusive leadership, then everyone is going to win from that. But that blame thing can play in. And I think the other thing, and I don't want to overplay this, but there was a report from the US recently, and some of this is probably in the context of Me Too, but this was basically indicating that some men, I mean, the numbers are in the kind of 20 to 30% wanting to avoid one-on-one contact with women at work, or perhaps avoid traveling with women, etc. I personally believe these views are probably a bit on the extreme side, but the point I'm getting at is there's some of that undercurrent, whether it's personal or due to a reaction to external circumstances, I think are causing some of the pushback, and we can put that in the context also of a general, perhaps a fatigue for diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say from my own experience, I've had senior male leaders say to me, actually, Anne, I'm not quite sure how I should be behaving now. It's making me a little bit nervous. It's making me a little bit uncertain of what's acceptable and what isn't. Yeah. So
you can get it wrong, and I mean, I know myself. I've been, as you know, we've known each other a number of years, and I've been involved in this work for 15 or 20 years now. But sometimes, particularly in a male banter, for example, can be difficult to deal with. You can't always be policing the situation. You're not always on point to push back on the challenge. And although in a professional workplace, these things are in my view, better dealt with than they were in the past. Those issues are still around, so it can take an energy of itself to create that. And again, I think that's why involving men in the whole thing, end to end, around achieving gender balance is so important.
So listening to you speak, Graham, the thing that's going through my mind is actually what can women do about it, and as organisations, how can we overcome barriers to actually getting men engaged in this initiative and this effort?
Yeah, again, I think we touched on it, but I think this point of making it a business issue is really important, and you've got to go beyond the generic business cases that we always see for D&I. I mean, I think most companies will have some variation of a business case which talks about talent, talks about engagement, employee engagement and productivity, and probably talks about brand and customers. And there's nothing wrong with those per se, but they're not necessarily going to motivate people. And so there's two aspects I think are important with a business case, and this is something we worked on in Shell, where there was a strong effort made to connect the case, the D&I business case, to some of the business drivers, in particular with the oil and gas sector around safety, and that proved successful. And again, some of this is about data, but it's coming to the perhaps obvious conclusion that more inclusive teams have better safety performance. And I'd also just like to cite a great piece of work which was done by Sodexo. And what they did, they took a lot of internal data. They did an extensive review of their staff. They surveyed about 50,000 staff, and they came up with a great piece of work which looked at the benefits of having gender balance. And basically, gender balance they defined as having between 30% and 70% women, or 70% and 30% men on a business team. Those business teams perform better, and they went beyond just the generic business case and looked at that in terms of things like operating margins, employee retention, safety, and employee engagement. Something that, listen to this, if you Google Sodexo gender balance study, you'll find it easily. And a good example of taking that generic and making it specific to the organisation. And the things I've covered there are more at the business level, at the macro level. Perhaps if I can touch also on a couple of things which I think more at the personal level, and this comes from some great Catalyst research. And I think again the things that can help in terms of engaging men are first of all, men having female mentors. Again, this is just about understanding different perspectives. So, sometimes it can be easy to go and find someone like me to be my mentor. So go and find someone who isn't like me as a mentor. That can sometimes help. I think experience of operating outside, normal masculine norms can help. And I've had the experience a couple of times in my working life of being the only male on an all-female leadership team.
And how did that feel?
We could go into length, I'm sure, on that one. And the answer to your question is it felt different. It didn't feel better or worse or right or wrong, but it was different.
Right.
And I quickly, it was a case of both assimilating, but having that experience of being the minority for a period of time. And you could choose to ignore it, of course, but you could also choose to understand this and be curious and just look at the different ways of working. So we can't all do this, but if you can put yourself sometimes in the position of being in the minority, I think that helps. And the last thing in this, which I find very encouraging, and we've talked about the business case, we've talked about the rational aspects of all this and all the ways we can tie it up to business performance and that. But again, from this Catalyst work, the other thing that came out was if this can be kind of positioned or put in the context of fairness and a sense of fair play, it's probably appealing to everyone. I mean, let's not categorize this, but it's certainly in terms of engaging men in gender diversity, bringing out that sense of fairness, bringing out that sense of fair play. In a sense, this is the right thing to do. Was very encouraging, and I know, having worked with you over the years, I'm sure something that you and I would very much associate with. We do this because it's the right thing to do. It's important. I think letting that conversation go deeper and wider is another way to get men more involved in this.
Oh, that's really helpful. And again, looking at this from a different angle, Graham, and as you say, fairness is a good thing and the right thing to do. But from a male perspective, I guess, I'm questioning, as a male leader, I'd be thinking, so what's in it for me? Why would I want to, participate in this? Am I going to be missing out on jobs or roles or promotions or progression? But actually, what is the benefit for me to be a supportive male in terms of gender diversity?
Yeah, the old what's in it for me question.
Yes,
again,
absolutely.
We can go back and rehearse, and we'll say, well, responsible leaders are going to clearly be interested in the business and the business results. Fine, let's move on from that. But again, I think coming back to some of the research that's been done on this, the what's in it for me, there's some good indications that this can also help at a personal level. And let's give some examples of that. Better physical and psychological health, more rewarding relationships, and really also having a better opportunity to live according to your own values rather than some, ways of behaving that somebody else or some organization might be perhaps imposing on you. So it gives a sort of a certain freedom in itself, and takes away some of the stresses which men will feel in the workplace as well. So these things we're not going to convince people through a paper or a set of data. I think it's a case of experiencing this as well. But it's good to see that from the research some of those personal benefits do seem to come through.
And is there any evidence about having women, senior women in businesses around producing better business results or better outcomes? Is there any evidence or research on that piece?
Yeah, I mean, if you track back over more than 10 years now, and I mean the McKinsey series on this has been a great piece of work and something done consistently over the years. And I think there's enough evidence from that, dare I name all the organizations, but Boston Consulting Group, Credit Suisse, we've already mentioned, Sodexo, there are others. There, in my view, is enough evidence out there which is linking the benefits of gender balance. Let's use the word, or gender equity as you described it earlier. Let's use those terms. Linked to financial performance, linked to, I mentioned safety, linked to innovation, and linked to employee engagement, and linked to other business drivers, as we might generically call them. Now, the cynics might say, well, yeah, this is all about correlation rather than causation. And okay, I'm not a statistician, but there is a truth in that. But I think the evidence is pretty strong when you triangulate this from a number of angles, and certainly has been enough to convince me over the years. But even if you don't want to accept any of that, come back to that fundamental of values, fairness, equity, the right thing to do. I think for many people that will be good enough. And in a sense, the business case, which I think is quite well established now from all this research, is almost the icing on the cake.
Thank you. And just more of a personal question, if I may. I mean, you and I have known each other a long time, and our paths first crossed, of course, when you were working for Shell as head of diversity and inclusion.
That's right. Yeah.
And I have to say, from a personal perspective, you were not the typical, in my view, person to be leading a D&I function. Well, because I think you were quite unique and quite unusual. I mean, you might want to just share with everybody who's listening a bit about your background and actually what sort of feedback you've had, because obviously you were very successful in that role, no question. But you were quite unusual.
Yeah, again, I mean, you said briefly in the introduction, as far as my bio is concerned, started off as an engineer and had a long and extremely satisfying career with one great company. So, yeah, maybe it's not the obvious role to end up with. I spent my last 6 years with Shell as the head of D&I. It was the most satisfying role of a very satisfying career. The word days, it could be the most frustrating role as well. But yeah, a lot of good things came from that. And I remember early on in the role, I used to get the question, it kind of went along the lines of, well, okay, Graham, so why are you a white male engineer doing D&I? And of course, there's all sorts of assumptions around that. Some of the assumptions are, of course, the only people that can do a D&I are those who themselves are underrepresented, etc. And at first, I was a bit affronted by this question. But then I actually I thought I'd turn this to a little bit to my advantage. So I respond to it in terms of, well, in my career, I've done technical roles, I've done sales business roles, I've done human resources roles, and another few along the way. And, in each role, you try and do your best and deliver and all the rest of it. But to me, the single thing that made the difference was the quality of the people you worked with and for, and the quality of leadership that was happening in those teams. So to me, D&I as a center or inclusion and diversity as a center of what makes good business performance was quite kind of obvious. And then I think putting it alongside a set of personal values and beliefs, etc. Perhaps some of which earlier in your career are not. One finds harder to articulate, but certainly as I moved on through my career, it got easier. I think that was important as well. So it was also a place where I could, explore some of that. I've done a lot. You mentioned workplace pride. I've done a lot with workplace pride based in Amsterdam around LGBTI workplace inclusion. Done a lot around mental health and accessibility in the workplace, and these are all things that aside from any business case, and you can make a business case for all of those things, they appeal greatly to a strong sense of fairness and values. So a bit of a long answer, but those are some of the things I would unpick from that.
No, that's a great answer, and there's no doubt that, as you say, you had a very long and successful career in Shell, but are actually continuing in a similar vein with the work you're doing now.
Yes.
So look, we're getting to the end of our discussion, sadly, because obviously I think there is a lot more we could talk about. But in terms of perhaps some concluding remarks for our listeners, some final points that you'd like people to take away and remember from this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, just trying to sum up some of the points that we've talked about here, Anne. I think as I say. Make this a business issue. Involve women, involve men in finding the solutions, but put it at the heart of the business. I think also, and this is something I learned a lot about in my time in Shell, is put this at the heart and centre of talent and leadership development. I think for too long, D&I has perhaps been seen as something a bit separate, a bit of a separate bubble. I do see it changing now significantly in leading organisations, much tighter tied in with leadership, with brand, with corporate social responsibility, etc. So I think putting it very much in the centre of how we do our business day to day is also very important. And I think lastly, it's about taking a personal responsibility around this. So what am I going to do? I can listen, I can receive the wisdom, I can go on the programs, etc., etc. What am I going to do? And one of the little phrases I've picked up, which I like, goes along the lines of the behaviours you walk past are the behaviours you accept. So when is it you're going to say, well, actually that behaviour is not acceptable, or I don't actually like that micro inequity, or I do hear or maybe just sense some bias in this conversation, and I'm going to be the one to step forward. And you can do that in a respectful and genuine and non-antagonistic way. But I think being prepared to do that and being prepared to sometimes take a bit of a personal risk, it can make a huge difference as well. So yes, link it to the business, get men and women involved, link it to leadership, link it to talent, etc. But probably the third, and to me the most important one, is be prepared to make the personal interventions and become someone who stands up as a role model on this subject.
Thank you, Graham. That was a really good conversation. I don't need to tell you how good it's been to have you here today. I'm sure people will want to hear and learn more about you. Is there a way that people can find out a bit more about what you're doing, your work, and get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'd welcome that. I'm involved in quite a few things at the moment, but probably from a practical point of view, the best way, if anyone would like to follow up or take this conversation further, is through LinkedIn, and you can just connect with me there, and we'll take it from there.
So Graham Sparks on LinkedIn. Thank you, Graham. That was absolutely superb. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to all our listeners for joining this podcast. I should just say, if you enjoyed this episode, then please remember to subscribe for our Insights podcast series, or you can explore the entire catalogue actually of the podcasts from all the podcasts from the Conference Board. You can enrol on our website, which is www.tcb.org/podcasts. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.